Welcome, everyone. This is Dalia Kinsey, who has just published the book Decolonizing Wellness, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Not our cursed previous attempts. I promise we're done with that. But I am so excited to host Dalia because getting to know Dalia and explore this work has been so exciting. And as someone who lives with white privilege myself, it is such an honor to be able to elevate the voices of brown and black folks who are doing really important work, but don't necessarily have the same opportunities and advantages that I have as somebody with white privilege. So I'm going to mostly be handing this over to Dalia, and I have some questions to guide us in our conversation. But this is really Dalia's time to shine, and I'm so excited to be able to offer that space. So, Dalia, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your name, your pronouns, where you live, the work that you do in general, and also where we can find you. And we're going to revisit that at the end about where we can all find Dalia's work. But go ahead and give us that too.
So my name is Dalia Kinsey. I'm non-binary. I don't use any pronouns, so just Dalia. And I am in Griffin. So this was originally Cherokee land, and that's not it, but that's the only group of people who's coming to mind right now. Of course, the head of the Trail of Tears is kind of close to here, so a lot of people were displaced. I am trying to remember what else was supposed to be in my intro.
And you're in Georgia, right?
Yes,
Yes.
yes. So I'm in the deep south, and I'm just super excited to have an opportunity to bring this messaging to more people because this is not something that ever would have been available when I was a kid in the 80s and 90s. There wasn't any affirming information available for queer folks, and honestly, for Black folks, there just was no such thing. So thank you for having me.
Yeah. So what work do you do like in a general sense before we get into talking about the book specifically? And where can we find you and the work that you're doing and buy the book and so on?
Okay, thanks. So I am a registered dietitian, but a holistic weight neutral dietitian. So that basically means none of my interventions ever focus on weight because being in a larger body is not problematic. That is just socialization. And I mostly right now am working with people through group coaching, a lot of on-site wellness, public speaking, that sort of thing, because I found whenever I try to do one-on-one, I cannot seem to escape people who secretly just want to diet. Even if they're wanting to be more comfortable with their bodies, one-on-one just draws people who are not there yet. And it's really difficult for me to navigate those types of relationships with somebody who's at their very beginning of body positivity or questioning the patriarchy or doing any kind of liberatory work. That's just not my passion. That's not my target. So I'm pulling away from the one-on-one. You can find the book anywhere books are sold. So all the big stores like Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Books a Million. But the easiest thing to do is just go to daliakinsey.com/book, and you'll see a lot of hyperlinks to places that you could buy it. You could also get it from a local bookstore. If they don't have it in stock, you can request it. And you also can just request it at a public library as well if it isn't available.
All right, and I've also put that link in the Zoom chat, and that will, of course, accompany the recording as well. So, talking about the book specifically, Decolonizing Wellness, who is the book for? Like, who is your core audience?
So I center QT BIPOC, so that's queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, because there really is nothing else available from a body positive perspective that addresses what it does to you to be socialized to question the way you intuitively love others and to question your value because you do not come in the right shade. So that is who is at the center of the book, but it's helpful for anyone who is wanting to reevaluate their relationship with wellness without focusing on weight, because that is just, it's not productive, and it really undermines your health to focus on weight. It doesn't have a place in wellness, honestly.
So when you talk about wellness and then you talk about health, for you specifically, the way that you use those words, are those basically synonyms for each other? Do they basically mean the same thing, or do they mean different things to you?
That's a good question. I think for me, it's not the same thing, because I would say my health is kind of like iffy because I have some autoimmune issues that are basically genetic, and I don't think I'll ever be considered a healthy person. I have disabilities related to mental health. So, according to other people's definitions, I'm not the picture of health. And honestly, if I could make some changes, I wouldn't have opted to have any autoimmune disease. But wellness is more of the full picture to me. Like, how are my relationships? How many times am I laughing a day? Do I feel like myself when I go out in the world? Am I partnered with somebody I really enjoy? Just, do I feel good? To me, that is where I'm coming from with wellness, and health feels a little more clinical. So, health, maybe you can work with whatever conditions you have, but there probably isn't that much you can really do. To me, wellness is the part that you have control over
Oh, that's really interesting.
in my head.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I really like, and I couldn't tell you, what the sort of dictionary definition, the official definition. I couldn't tell you what the CDC considers to be the definition of health or wellness. But I'm really intrigued by this concept of wellness being the parts that are within your control. So how did you, as a dietitian, as you know, because it's your life experience, that is a world that is very focused on health and on wellness for various definitions of wellness, and on in very invested in diet culture. So how did you get from whatever your standpoint was when you went to school for this? Like, what was your journey like from that point to writing a book that's sort of rebelling against a lot of that world and that worldview?
As a kid, I always felt like a budding feminist, which is not cool in Georgia in the 80s. That was like radical to think that maybe people assigned female at birth should have equal rights. But, things got better early 2000s. So when I was in school, I wasn't putting together that feminism and diet culture do not mix if you're really paying attention. So I was pretty snowed thinking that everything that was being taught was accurate initially, that this obsessive focus on having a BMI within a certain range was actually appropriate. But the deeper I got into my studies, the more obvious it became that the biases that they had were everywhere. It was in the classroom, it was in the textbooks, and the biases that were easier for me to identify because I knew they were false based on my lived experience was all the racial bias, like all the assumptions that Black people are too dumb to be able to feed themselves, which is not an exact quote, but that was the gist. And all these assumptions that all Black people in the United States have a homogenous food culture, which is ridiculous. Even in the classrooms that some of these discussions were happening in, there would be me from the Southern United States, half of me anyway, and the other half is half Cuban and half Jamaican. So even right there, that's like 3 different food cultures that influence how I eat. And the other person in class was from Ghana. There was one more who self-identifies as Black, who was from the Dominican Republic. And when we would ask, what do you mean? What type of Black people? What are you talking about? It was beyond our peers' comprehension that we were not homogenous. And rather than listening to what we were trying to say, they just kind of rolled their eyes and continued the discussion. And so I started to think, well, if they're all wrong about this and they're taking it like it's fact and writing notes and ignoring the lived experience of everybody in the room, I really shouldn't be believing everything they're saying without questioning it. And from there, not so much believing in them and getting totally burned out on the obsessive focus on weight and how many of my classmates clearly had untreated eating disorders. Some of them did disclose that they had treated eating disorders. I don't know why they would choose to work in such a triggering field if they're still working through that. But starting to see that people were prescribing disordered eating to people who are fat while only getting concerned about the thin people when they were at death's door really made me question, like, is anything that they're doing here going to help anybody health-wise? And by the time I finished and graduated, I wondered if that was even what I wanted to do. I was so burned out on the racism and the fat phobia. I wasn't sure that there was any way I could use the degree that would feel right to me. But then I thought, well, public health feels more neutral. It's not going to be focused on weight management. I thought we're going to actually be using science. That's one of the things that's the most irksome about dietitians is that they're always saying the difference between us and a nutritionist who isn't a dietitian is that everything we do is evidence-based. That's the story. But you know that there is not evidence to support dieting as a health intervention. It doesn't make sense that it's being recommended. Any other thing that you recommend to people, it has to be backed and you show that there's some efficacy. We see that by and large, dieting does not work for anybody over the long term. So then why do people keep recommending it like it's even a thing? Let's assume that like the fact that fat phobia damages your health because it adds to your stress and it adds to discrimination and it limits your access to equal healthcare, ignoring all that, still, if it doesn't work for more than 1% of people, how is that a recommendation, like ever? So I just got burned out on how the messaging they were putting out there to students was so inconsistent with what they were doing in practice, and seeing all the conflicts with who they're kind of in bed with from a sponsoring standpoint, and just seeing that it was all really just about making money, as most things are, not really about health. And that even in public health, again, it's just about maintaining the status quo and keeping these systems running, not really about anybody's health. And the fat phobia there was honestly beyond disgusting. There were times when it just gave me such rage that I didn't know if I would come back the next day. Like forced weigh-ins for employees, counseling people on weight loss that didn't ask for any counseling on weight loss, and harping on it and wanting to weigh people at every staff meeting. Who does that? And all it ever did was stress people out. That did not improve anybody's health. And you could see people gaining more and more weight, probably eating as a coping mechanism in that extremely fat phobic atmosphere. And even people that were considered healthy according to their BMI were terrified of gaining weight because it was so clear that everybody was watching you, and that the assumption was the bigger you are, the dumber you are. Because if you have this degree in nutrition and your body's still large, then the story is you must be some kind of dummy.
Mm-hmm. And you have talked in our previous cursed attempt to have this, and in other contexts before that as well, talked about I believe you identify as a small fat person, and for folks who aren't familiar with that term, there's an informal set of what we call categories that are a way for us to be able to talk about levels of privilege, where we might say, for example, my body is larger than Dahlia's, and so I have a lower level of body size related privilege there, and so my body is on the edge between large fat and super fat. And if you Google for the word categories, you will be able to see some articles about this that talk about this. Some people choose to use these words and some don't. Neither is right or wrong. But my point about this is that Dahlia's body size was still probably quite a bit larger than the average dietitian, too.
100%. Some of them, especially considering how common it is for a lot of these folks to have eating disorders. I mean, I'm talking visible collarbones, just criticizing each other when they went from like a size 6 to a size 8. Just a lot of toxicity. And I back then was like 50 pounds lighter than I am right now. And I was still way too big for them. So yeah, it was a very toxic atmosphere. And at the size that I'm at, yes, seats on airplanes have gotten tight, but I can still get in them. And, I don't necessarily have to have a chair that doesn't have arms. So my experience of discrimination as being a larger person is nothing like what I've seen other people experience. But when you are a fat dietitian, you get a lot of blowback and undermining. It's part of the reason why I don't work in a clinical setting, because I had people say to me a couple of times in public health, well, how are you doing nutrition education? Look at you. And that was 50 pounds ago. So that was just not the scene for me.
And something I want to touch on really quickly too is back at the beginning of our discussion today, I talked about having white privilege, and just now I've talked about having less size privilege. I want to touch base really quickly on the concept of intersectionality right quick for folks who may not be familiar with that. There's a good chance that if you're watching this recording, you already know that concept, but just in case, because this is really important in the context of what Dalia is talking about here, and talking about decolonization, which we're going to get to here in a second. Intersectionality is the concept, and if you, this is something I also advise Googling because I don't have the definition in front of me, but it's basically the concept that the more marginalized or oppressed groups you belong to, the more those oppressions stack up and the less privilege you have overall. So, for example, if Dalia and I both went to the same doctor, I might be treated worse based on my body size, but I might actually be treated better because I'm white. So I have that specific marginalization that I'm in a very large body size. But Dalia is both in a large body size and Black and queer. And those things all add up and they intersect with each other over time and over interactions. And so I want everybody to be holding this in mind as we talk about levels of privilege and how they interact with each other. And also, I didn't think to say it earlier, but we will have some time for questions at the end. So if you have questions as we go ahead and type them into the chat, or you can hold them until the end, and we're going to have a space to ask those. If you type it into the chat, I'll ask that for you at the end, or you can just hold it and we'll turn on everybody's mics at the end and you can just ask. But let's jump to that decolonizing, because I think that's going to be a term that people may not be as familiar with. So what does decolonizing mean as a very general concept? And then what does it mean for wellness?
So as a general concept, it's about trying to reverse some of the damage that colonization has done to a lot of cultures. And in a lot of cases, it means reclaiming traditional practices that have been derided or seen as barbaric or savage, and understanding that these things have value, and it's only through the lens of white supremacy that they have no value. And in terms of wellness, especially in the book, it's about decentering whiteness and decentering these colonial European heteronormative standards that are still influencing us now and are still the standards by which we are judging ourselves, and sometimes also very frequently the standards by which we are being judged. And even it's interesting, I was thinking the other day about whether or not it was a good idea to write a blog post on traditional African religions and kind of reclaiming some of that. And I thought, oh, I don't want people to think that I'm not science friendly. Or basically, the thought came up was, oh, what if people think less of me? What if they think I'm uneducated or uninformed because I, practice traditional African religions? And if you're Christian in the US, you don't ever have to worry that someone's going to think they know something about you just because you say something about your Christianity. But when it comes to things that are kind of outside what's been accepted, like if this is not a religion that was brought here by the colonizers, and you say you practice it, people may think, oh, that's all superstition. When in reality, when we look at all these belief systems, like faith is like a pretty nebulous type of thing. There's no more logic involved in one faith than another from what I've seen. But through that lens, it feels less than, and then you're less inclined to be open about it because you don't want to be ridiculed. And then you may find internalized stigma where you're kind of embarrassed to openly be different or to openly not be as assimilated as maybe you think you should be, or as you were trained to think you should be.
So when that comes to health and wellness, again, keeping in mind that those may not be exactly the same thing here, but decolonizing that, um, I think there's a real cultural feel in the United States today that health is health, in the sense that um, that numbers are numbers, and we know that specific things, and again, some of this may be evidence based and some of this may just be what everybody knows, which may or may not be reality based, but there's this sense that okay, well, up to us down to a certain point, a lower blood pressure number is always better. That we know that a blood pressure reading in this specific range is the optimal. And so I think there may be some resistance from folks to talking about decolonizing this when so much of what we think about as being health or think about as being wellness seems like it's very objective. So what are your thoughts on that? And also, what is maybe something specific? Because you gave the religion example, which is a really great example. Because again, it's not something we in the majority are really forced to think about until it affects us or until somebody brings it to our attention. But maybe something related to food or health markers or something that reflects that white centering, that white supremacy, that shows why this makes a difference.
Yeah, there's so many levels to that, because even the fact that here in the US, we only seem to respect things that come to us through some kind of hierarchical lens, right? It has to come from an institution that's been vetted, and vetted institutions in this country typically are still institutions founded by older straight white men, and if you're doing something outside of that, oh, it's not real, it's not legit, it's airy fairy, there's not enough evidence to support it. But the truth of the matter is there's plenty of things that we still don't fully understand how they work, and that doesn't mean they're not beneficial. And maybe if you can't sell it, there will never be enough research to validate that a certain intervention works. So there are some foods and herbs that have been proven to be just as effective as pharmaceuticals. Well, you're not going to see that information everywhere, because if it costs you like 50 cents to get it from the store, why would anybody tell you about it, right? The way this country has been from its beginning is driven by profit, and that's profit over people. So most of the things that we see, it isn't necessarily that it's just a fact. It's that there was somebody who wanted to fund that study, meaning that someone stood to benefit from it. People don't just do stuff for shits and giggles, right? They do it because there's an opportunity to earn money in relation to whatever you find. In addition to that, sometimes people are swayed to look for a specific answer because of where the funding is coming from. So all that to say, like all these things, oh, we have all this definite research. It's like the other things that are missing, it could have just been a matter of there was no financial incentive for you to do the same amount of research. And especially when I think about just the way people just don't question some things that we're still using as health markers. Like there is a different standard for kidney function for Black people still. If you go to a dialysis clinic, you're going to see like, well, what's a normal GFR for Black Americans? And then also there's still people who believe that Black Americans just tend to have weaker lungs. Now, that is a belief that comes straight out of the transatlantic slave trade, but there is still a difference in how they will measure lung function in Black people versus not Black people. And just that belief that you can look at someone and know what their genetic history is also totally coming through that filter of how race became defined in the United States and how you had to define like what degree of biracial makes you still somebody's property. That absolutely affects the assumptions that people are making, because if you're grouping all of these people together based on one characteristic, skin color is one characteristic, it is not linked inextricably to any other characteristic. So grouping people together based on skin color would be like grouping people together based on eye color among white Americans. Would you believe that that makes any sense? Like, oh, people with green eyes, they have poor lung function. You know, they're kind of lazy. So it's good that we get them out there working and don't let them rest too much or they'll never get up and do anything. Like, would anybody believe that? But we've heard it for so long, it feels like it's real. And the weird thing about humans and the brain is that if you believe it's real, in many ways, it starts to be real. So the differences in health outcomes have become real because we as a society have made race real, and the disparities determine how your health plays out. But then some physicians really do believe it's linked to actual genetics. And there's also people with the queer layer, going back to the intersectionality, there are a lot of older practitioners out there that were in the workforce when the DM5, is those the right letters I'm wanting? When
DSM.
there you go.
Yeah, there you go.
When it was still, I think I thought the S was a 5. There were still people saying that homosexuality was a mental illness. So even though, you know, that's no longer the case, when people notice higher rates of depression among queer people, and they were trained at a time when it was classified as a mental illness, well, then their assumption is most likely going to be that the queerness comes before the depression and the anxiety, instead of that the disparities cause anxiety and depression. So they're going to assume that you can't really get out of this because you're supposed to be depressed because that's what people like you are, instead of them saying like, let's look at who you're spending time around. How often do you feel safe in the course of a day? Where can you go where your queerness is a non-issue? And if you have multiple marginalized identities, it's really challenging sometimes to find a place where you can just be a human being. So you may go hang out with queer folks at Pride, you will inevitably deal with some kind of racist microaggression. And if you go hang out with Black folks It takes, I don't know, 30 minutes before somebody says something homophobic. So that is not being addressed in healthcare, the chronic stress that comes from being marginalized. And if we know that stress tears the body down, literally everybody knows that. Everybody knows someone who they're pretty sure died of a broken heart. You know, when you have one spouse go and the next person's dead within 5 days, it's a real thing. There's even a word for that in Japanese. People know that emotions do affect the way the body functions. So why would we think that ignoring chronic stress from racism, from transphobia, from homophobia makes any sense if we're talking about trying to help people live long, healthy lives? How can you ignore that and then decide to focus instead on body size?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and again, this comes back to intersectionality and how things layer. Yeah. Yeah, because the more, like Dalia was just saying, the more of these intersections that you have, the harder it's going to be for you to exist, to find spaces to exist in, where you're not still getting uh, random crap thrown at you because of who you are. Like Dalia was just saying, if you're in a group full of black folks and you're getting homophobic stuff thrown at you or thrown around at you, like where you're still having to listen and absorb that. Or if you are in a group of fat folks who are being ableist or whatever, and you're both fat and disabled, you're getting more and more of these stress layers, and we know that stress affects the body. There's a whole field of study related to this. Very famously, there is a book called The Body Keeps the Score that that many, if you're watching this and you are a healthcare provider, there's a good chance you've heard of or read this book. And it's all about how the body holds on to trauma and displays that trauma. It's also a very fat phobic book, which is really unfortunate. And again, that comes back to these, all kinds of things that we've discussed, like what everybody knows about health. And because here's this researcher who has done fundamental research. This is like he created this whole field of how trauma is stored in the body, this whole field of study. And yet he's willing to, like, this groundbreaking researcher who, for at least one entire chapter, falls back on what everybody knows about body size. And it was really, shocking to run across that when I read that book, and it threw me out of the book. I never finished it. But coming back to Dalia's book, which does not have a giant fat phobic chapter right in the middle of it. There's a couple of specific things that just caught me as I went through the book that I really wanna ask Dalia about. And one of those is in chapter 5, where you're talking about celebrities and celebrities being praised for specific body parts like toned arms. And as we talked about last time, the first person I think of when I think about well-known public figures who are praised for their arms is Michelle Obama. But it's interesting because on a surface level, it sounds like celebrities being praised for their bodies instead of turned. So it's Friday afternoon, and I can't words anymore. I'm out. I'm sorry.
The reason you can still remember things is I keep feeling like in the middle of a sentence, I'm like, where was I headed with this? I know it's the Friday.
So let me just try the whole thing again. So it seems like it would be a relief to see celebrities being praised for their bodies, as opposed to, there it is again. It's the same spot.
Maybe
torn down, not turned down. Torn
Got
down.
it.
I'm sorry. That word just didn't want to.
With our powers combined, like what was I trying to say? I couldn't say DSM. So the weird thing is the way you can brainwash somebody, you can do it, or control someone, you can do it with positive or negative reinforcement. So when you get positive reinforcement, it's still training you. It's training you to prioritize or value certain things, or to think, oh, this is how I get praise, this is how I get acceptance, this is how I can be worthy. And one of the things that I know, as when I was younger, I was constantly being told how beautiful I was, how stunning. I was always getting stopped in the street. It was constant. Well, at the time, it seemed neutral. Sometimes it felt like it was a little over the top, or sometimes it made me feel unsafe. But when I had the audacity to stop looking like I was under 20, the way the compliments dried up, well, then it was obvious that that wasn't neutral. That was damaging. Because what if something happens to Michelle Obama's arms and they're not whatever they are right now anymore? Like that could really be upsetting. It makes you maybe get attached to the way your body is in one moment in time. And the one thing you can count on your body to do is keep changing. That's it's always changing. So to focus so much on the body could make somebody feel really nervous about changes. And anyone else who sees that, oh, like Cameron Diaz, they like to pick her body apart too, Jennifer Aniston. You see these women that you know are considered the ideal form of feminine body according to the US. They're white, their hair is straight, they're thin, and they look like they come from money. If they can't be fully acceptable, then what does that tell everybody else? Like if they could only have perfect arms or their ankles are great, but they've got a weird toe, that just trains you to pick your body apart. And then you create standards for every single part of your body, which is just going to lead to self-rejection and maybe some self-loathing. Because if you don't see yourself as a full person, then you're going to get caught on things like, oh, why is my arm this way? Why is my stomach this way? Why is this boob different from that boob? Why are the boobs, acting like they know what gravity is, because like all your body does is change. But it really makes it hard for you to accept the fact that you are more than your body. To see that hyper focus, that lets you know that to a lot of people, we are just our body. And I don't think that's healthy for anyone. So it really makes you think when you're giving people praise, remember that none of that's neutral. And so if you're complimenting someone on like how beautiful they are, is that helpful? Because they can't control their beauty. They didn't do anything to get it. And they don't know how their face may change in the future. And even going through COVID, it's been so interesting to see how people have realized only after losing some abilities how attached they were to being able-bodied. So you don't know that you're really fixated on like how much people love your hair until it starts falling out. And you don't know that, it really means a lot to you and makes you feel worthy for people to like, I don't know, your perfect face until it's covered in wrinkles, So it really is a message that they're sending. And you even see the way, by and large, the media throws these women away once they age. You can't even get a part anymore. You have to play grandmas when you turn 30. All of that messaging is definitely being received by every one of us. Even when you try to ignore it and it's trash, it tends to get in there somewhere.
Yeah, yeah. Just really quickly, I want to give an example of this. I looked at my hands the other day. I'm 41, and I was going to hold my hand up, but you're not going to be able to see it. It's too fine a texture. But I realized that at 41, the back of my hands, the skin is starting to be a tiny bit crepey. They call it crepey skin, like crepe, like the fabric that's wrinkled. And and the first thing that flashed into my head when I noticed that, in general, I'm pretty good with signs of aging. I've got like cool little gray streaks here, and I've got some crow's feet starting, and I'm into that. But I saw the back of my hands, and the first thing that flashed into my head was sometimes when I click through and read a news article, and there's those scammy ads at the bottom. One that I saw a whole bunch a couple years ago, over and over and over, was one of these, one weird trick type banner ads, and it was about crepey skin. And I didn't even realize it at the time, but that got in my head. And when we see tabloids and TV shows and magazine articles and all this media over and over and over on a specific thing like these celebrity body parts, like that gets into our head. And this was such an
Yeah.
interesting example because something I wouldn't have thought twice about otherwise. I would have just been like, "Oh, my skin's changing. Cool." But suddenly it was all I could think about was, "Oh no. My skin is
Yes.
changing."
It's just bananas, like how things that people don't even do to hurt you still have an effect on you. I noticed that I can see the aging, it's like the cleavage aging. And I don't know why. I just thought that only happened to people who suntan a lot. I didn't know that was for everybody,
Huh.
but now I know.
And now I'm like, "Oh, what's going on with my cleavage?"
Just looking 40. I turned 40 this year, and it's just been interesting, but it was easier to turn 40 than it was to turn 27 because I just felt like, wow, I can't say I'm in my early 20s anymore. Like I'm exiting the age of everyone sees you as just like young and worth staring at, which is weird because I felt like I didn't even want to be stared at, but I didn't not want to be, you know what I mean?
I mean, by the time I hit adulthood, I was already significantly fat, so I don't actually know what you mean. And again, this is
That's
where we talk about
interesting.
these
Yeah.
intersections of privilege and the different types of privilege. Yeah. No, I just got like everybody assumed I was a 40-year-old mom from the time I was 20.
Oh,
Um,
that's
because I just
fascinating.
got slotted into the matronly category right away. But
Oh, yeah. And that is a real thing. Someone pointed this out to me. This is why it's so important to have a diverse array of people in your life because you will not notice things a lot of times that don't affect you unless they're
yeah.
crazy blatant. Because I hadn't realized, someone mentioned to me, oh, they don't make clothes for women 35 and up. And I was like, what? Somebody said this to me when I was in my 20s. I'm like, ah, that doesn't make sense. Like, they're women 35 and up everywhere. Of course, they're wearing clothes. They got them from somewhere. But you can tell, like, they're not cut for the way the body tends to change, the way, as your hormones change when you get older, the places that the adipose tissue tends to go, you'll notice clothes don't fit like they used to. I mean, I remember a time when every time I went to the store, everything fit exactly the way it did in the picture. But once you get to a certain point, they've just decided not to make room for us or acknowledge our existence. By and large, older femme presenting people are invisible in this patriarchal system.
Yeah, and sometimes that's useful. I mean, I don't get catcalled when I'm invisible. So
That's
so
nice.
and it also means dudes will randomly cut in front of me in line because
You
they
know what,
literally
though?
can't see me. It's like I don't exist.
Wow.
But
You know what? I don't know, but I feel like that might be disrespect reserved for white women because I've seen that
hmm,
happen and I don't know what that's about. No one
huh.
has ever done that to me. Maybe because they're afraid, like the stereotype is that, oh,
That
Black
you're
femme
gonna
presenting
like
people are
snap your
aggressive.
fingers at them
Yeah,
and
I'm
say
going
something
to
sassy.
move my head around. Yeah, so maybe that's why.
I don't know.
The
Well,
layers,
okay.
you never know why you're being treated poorly. Like there's a
Yeah.
lot.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, something for us to explore another time because as much as I would love to just make you talk to me for the rest of the evening, we're about ready to start wrapping up. But really quickly, another thing that I saw as I was reading, and I don't remember which chapter this was in, so you'll all have to find it as you go through your own copies. But you talk about the term hunger trauma, and that
Mhm.
was something that really was resonant, but that I had never heard before. So really quickly, can you go into talking about what that means and what the ramifications might be?
Yeah, if you go through periods of time as a child where you have to be hungry, it doesn't necessarily mean you're neglected. It doesn't mean you weren't fed 3 meals a day. But when you're having lots of growth spurts, sometimes 3 meals a day is still going to leave you hungry. And if you're in a lower income working class family, there might not be money for extras and for snacks. So you get accustomed to when there's food available, especially free food. That's a huge trigger for people. You eat as much of it as possible because you don't know when you're going to get to have like unlimited access to food again. So you go to a party, you eat the whole time. And you see kids doing this. There's a big difference. I mean, you can see it right away between a child who's able to like free graze all day and a child whose food is being controlled tightly. There are lots of different ways that people end up having that hunger trauma. It could be a parent who's not allowing the child to lead the feeding process, or it could be people who just literally don't have the food. I grew up in a family of 5. Both of my parents were there. They were good parents, but we were on a pretty limited budget. So, yes, we ate 3 times a day, but there usually wasn't enough for seconds, or at least not everybody could have seconds. But the person who got to have seconds was whoever finished first, because in theory, that must have meant you were the hungriest and you needed the most. What that really trained us to do was to eat as quickly as possible so that we would get seconds. And if you tell somebody who's been through that to diet, then you're asking them to put their body through that same sensation of not being enough and not knowing, not having enough and not knowing when the next serving of food is coming. And that's absolutely going to trigger binges and out of control eating. And the thing that sucks about binging is that generally it makes you really uncomfortable. It hurts and it's not satisfying. And ideally, when you eat food, it should delight you or energize you or soothe you. It shouldn't hurt you. But when people encourage you to restrict after you endured involuntary restriction, that's going to make it impossible for you to have a peaceful relationship with food.
So I have 2 more questions, really, really, really quick, and then we're gonna get to our Q&A. So think about what questions you have for Dalia, and again, you can pop those in the chat, or at the end, I'll open it up and you can ask yourself. So next to last question. This is my favorite question to ask people because it's always so different. What do you personally like to eat for breakfast?
I'm going to stick with seafood. Like the first time during our, rough recording, I was thinking like eggs Benedict with salmon or shrimp. But then I realized also fried fish and grits. Like that to me, that's breakfast.
Okay. Okay. Oh, now I want grits. All right. And finally, just remind us one more time where we can find you and buy the book.
Go to Dallas. Go to daliakinsey.com/book. Unfortunately, social media and I just we're not gelling. So the best thing to do is to jump on the newsletter. That's the easiest way to keep in touch with me. And when you hit reply to anything I send, then it goes straight to my inbox. I read all my emails. So that's the best way to keep in touch with me. Pretend it's the 90s.
I would like to subscribe to your newsletter.
Yes, exactly. I'll put that in the chat as well. I just moved to Substack.
Yes.
I don't know if everybody's using it, but so far I really like it. And I'm going to have all kinds of cool content on there for real this time.
So feel free to unmute yourself and ask your questions. And I'll give it a quiet 30 seconds here and let you ask anything you want to ask. And then if nobody has anything, then I have another question.
That gives me time to cut and paste.
Yeah. I'm going to click on that too while I'm thinking about it, so I have it open. Oh yeah, put the book link in there too.
And what a difference Friday makes to cognitive function.
Yeah, this is that coasting to the end at this point. All right, so if you have any questions that come up for you later, or if you are watching the recording, you can check the links and ask Dalia directly. I have one really silly question to wrap us up with. Is that plant real? I've been dying to know.
Oh, so embarrassing. No, it is not. I have such shame about my artificial plants.
Why?
Because I just keep killing all my plants. I do right now. I have Lucky Bamboo. I know that's not the real name, but the scientific name is too complicated for me. Alive on my desk.
Okay.
But half of it has turned yellow. I don't know why. I read that it could be fertilizer burn. I don't know. That's what I'm hoping in the future, that I can be a plant mom like you and all the other plant people. But
now I feel like I was unintentionally flexing on you. No.
Well, you can't. I just have the fake one.
What you can't see is the dying plant on that blue bookshelf behind me.
Well, at least I know sometimes it happens to you too. I don't know why, like, plants don't. I love green and I love being out in nature, but once I bring that stuff inside, it doesn't last long.
I've just killed so many that eventually I figured out how not to kill a lot of them. That's all.
Okay, that helps. Oh, yeah, just don't give up. And that's such a good point. I think we've mostly been trained to think if we're not good at something right away, that it's not for us, because that's kind of how they train you in school. You have exactly one semester to learn it. And if you're still getting Fs, then forget it. You'll never get it, which is not true. Some of us probably just needed more time. Yeah. So yeah, I need to adjust the way I'm looking at this plant thing.
Yeah, and honestly, big plants like the fake one that's behind you, they take a ton of light, a ton of attention. I mean, depending on the plant, they take a lot of resources. And then honestly, one of the reasons that I have a whole bunch of plants behind me that you can't see, and I totally staged these two. These are real, but they belong in my bathroom. They don't stay here because there's not enough light right here. Because I know it looks like there's a lot of light coming in the windows, but it's not actually a very bright room. So those don't live.
I love the idea of plants in the bathroom. That sounds wonderful.
But you also can't see all the ones that are ratty. Like this one is farther behind because it's got some ratty leaves on it, and you can't see them because they're out of focus. So
okay, that helps. That helps. And it actually it's pretty good that you thought it might be real.
Yeah.
As a plant person. So that makes me feel a little better.
Yeah. I mean, it's green. It looks good. What does it matter? I was just going to be super, super impressed if it was real.
Then I turned it around. Okay, good. Melinda also is feeling my pain. Oh, yeah. I need to get a friend who wants to come help me with plants. I actually live in a 55 plus community. I probably could just go outside and ask literally anybody. Oh, yeah. They're always trying to teach people stuff around here.
They'd be like, honey, I will tell you. I will come in and water these plants.
Exactly.
Let the retirees help.
Yeah, I really need to. I've been so consumed with all this other personal development work, because I will say, when you're trying to change your relationship with your body, oh boy, it takes time, because we've spent our whole lives being told to reject ourselves.
Yeah. And it takes effort and resources too. Just like dieting takes resources and effort. Hopefully as you untangle those things and stop dieting, it will take you fewer resources.
Right.
But healing takes resources. And like, if you're spending, I don't know, let's see, an hour a week in therapy, and you're reading a couple of books on anti-diet principles, and you're reading Decolonizing Wellness, and you are, I don't know, doing those things, you may not have time to take care of a big old tree.
It's true. This is true.
Dalia, thank you so much, both for your time today and for doing this a second time. I'm so grateful to have your time a second time, both so that we can give people a good recording this time to watch later, and just to have your time again. Just really
Thank you
appreciate
so
that.
much. I really appreciate your support. It's always so fun talking to you.
Oh, you too. All right. Thank you so much for everybody who was able to attend. We had one person who needed to leave earlier, and I don't know if you saw it in the chat, but they said that they were really enjoying it and just had to pop out earlier. So we'll make sure everybody gets a recording here somewhere between a few days and a week from now. And if you are watching the recording later, thanks for taking a look. And I will also put this up on the blog and on YouTube, so you'll be able to find it everywhere. And I hope everybody has a good evening. Thanks again, Dalia.